My daughter committed arson, but the police are refusing to see her side of it. I got the call at 3 a.m. that Nora had been arrested after burning down a bar. By the time I arrived, fire trucks were still hosing down hot spots while investigators photographed everything. Nora sat in the back of a police car with her hands cuffed behind her back, a weird look of pride on her face. Nora, what did you do? She'd been sober for 18 months. Mom, I know what you're thinking, Nora said, her voice raw from smoke. But I'm still sober. I swear to God I didn't relapse. Then why would you burn down a bar? I couldn't understand this. We'd worked so hard to get her healthy after she nearly died at 20. The bar owner Robert stormed over when he saw me. Your psycho daughter destroyed everything. 30 years of business. She's going to rot in prison. Screw you, Nora spat at him, trying to stand, but the cuffs kept her awkward in the back seat. You're a murderer. I run a legal business, Robert shouted, getting in her face. You're just another drunk who can't handle watching normal people have fun. I shoved him back from my daughter. Mom, he kills people, Nora said, crying harder now. He sends his bartenders into AA meetings to hunt us. They pretend to be in recovery and then drag people back to drink. Robert's face twitched. That's bullcrap. You can't prove anything. James is back in rehab, Nora screamed at him. He was 2 years sober and your bartender convinced him one beer wouldn't hurt. Stacy had 5 years and now she's dying of liver failure because your people wouldn't leave her alone. Nobody forced them to drink, Robert said with a nasty smile. Alcoholics always blame everyone else. You pay $50 for every person from AA they get drinking again, Nora said, her whole body shaking. Tyler told me when I visited him in detox. You have a bounty system for destroying people's sobriety. I stared at Robert in horror. You target people in recovery? It's not illegal, he said, shrugging like it was nothing. If they're so weak they can't say no, that's not my problem. Nora was sobbing now. Tomorrow you are having your Chips for Shots event. Trade in your sobriety chip for free drinks all night. Great marketing, Robert said proudly. I'm a businessman. My sponsor was going to go, Nora screamed, straining against the cuffs. 10 years sober and her husband just left her and she texted me saying maybe it was time to give up. Your fucking event was going to kill her. My stomach turned. Did you call the police? Report this? I tried everything. Nora was hyperventilating now. Health department, state licensing, the cops. Everyone said it's not illegal. He can advertise however he wants. AA meetings are public. There's no law against hunting alcoholics. So you torched my bar, you crazy bitch? Robert laughed. 30 years of work because you're too weak to stay sober? Garrett is dead, Nora screamed so loud her voice broke. He had his sobriety date tattooed on his wrist and your people still went after him and now he's dead. He was 23 years old. Robert stepped back slightly as officers looked over, but kept smiling. Not my fault your friends are weak. They were trying to get better, I said, rage building in my chest. They were fighting for their lives and you sabotaged them for money. Mom, I know arson is wrong, Nora said, gasping through sobs. But tomorrow he was going to destroy my sponsor, and that new kid with 30 days, and that mom trying to get her kids back. I couldn't watch more people die. You're going to prison for decades, Robert said with satisfaction. Arson's a felony. 5 to 20 minimum. Your life is over. The detective walked over saying they needed to take Nora to booking for felony arson, destruction of property, potential attempted murder. The building was empty, Nora said desperately. I checked every room, set off the fire alarm, made sure no one was inside. Doesn't matter, Robert said, grinning. You're done. And I'll rebuild with the insurance money and throw an even bigger event. Maybe call it the Nora Special since you gave me all this free publicity. The detective pulled Nora out of the car and started walking her to the transport van. She looked back at me, mascara streaking down her face. Mom, I'm sorry, but I couldn't let him kill anyone else. The only life ruined here is yours, Robert called after her, already dialing his phone. Enjoy prison, you pathetic drunk. I stood there watching them put my daughter in the van while Robert laughed on his phone about rebuilding bigger and better. My daughter had saved lives and she was going to prison while this monster would keep hunting vulnerable people for profit. The van pulled away with Nora inside, and I had no idea what to do. My legs wouldn't move for the longest time. The van's red lights got smaller and smaller until they turned a corner and disappeared completely. My car was maybe 20 feet away, but it took everything I had to make myself walk over to it. I dropped my keys twice trying to get them in the door. My hands were shaking, so bad I had to use both of them to turn the key. I sat in the driver's seat for 10 minutes just staring at the steering wheel. I didn't know who to call first. A lawyer? The jail? Someone who knew how this stuff worked? I drove home on autopilot and spent the rest of the night sitting at my kitchen table with my phone in my hand. At exactly 6 in the morning, I called the county jail. The woman who answered sounded tired and told me Nora wouldn't be processed until later this morning. She said the bail hearing would be tomorrow afternoon at the earliest. I wrote down the visiting hours on the back of an envelope. 8 to 9 at night on weekdays. She gave me a website for putting money in Nora's commissary account. My hand was still shaking when I hung up. I walked into Nora's room and sat on her bed. Her desk was covered in AA stuff like always. The big book, her journal, meeting schedules. I picked up a spiral notebook and opened it. Inside was a list of names with dates next to them. James, 2 years sober, targeted at 6 months. Stacy, 5 years, approached after Tuesday meeting. There were 23 names on the list. Some had notes like bartender named Mike or offered free birthday drinks. Garrett's name was at the bottom with a black X drawn next to it. My phone started buzzing with texts. People from Nora's AA group were asking if it was true about the fire. One woman sent me a screenshot from the bar's Facebook page. Chips for shots tomorrow night. Trade your sobriety chip for free drinks all night. The more days you have, the more you save. I had to run to the bathroom to throw up. I called the health department next. The woman who answered sounded like she'd had this exact conversation before. She told me there was no law against advertising to specific groups, as long as they weren't serving minors or people who were visibly drunk. Marketing was protected speech. She said they got complaints about that bar all the time, but there was nothing they could do. Around noon, my phone rang with a number I didn't know. It was the public defender's office. The lawyer assigned to Nora's case sounded young and talked fast. He said he had 40 other cases this month and could give me 5 minutes tomorrow before the bail hearing. He told me to bring any documents that showed Nora was a good person, character references, job history, that kind of thing. The bail hearing was at 2:30 the next day. I got there an hour early and sat on a wooden bench outside the courtroom. The public defender showed up 5 minutes before we went in. He barely looked at the papers I brought. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Nora came in wearing orange jail clothes with her hands cuffed in front of her. She looked smaller somehow. The judge was an older woman who didn't look up from her papers. The prosecutor asked for $100,000 bail. He called it domestic terrorism. The public defender said that was excessive for a first offense. The judge set bail at $50,000. I felt my knees go weak. That meant I needed $5,000 for a bail bondsman. The public defender entered a not guilty plea. The whole thing took less than 10 minutes. That evening, I went to the jail for visiting hours. They put me in a room with scratched plexiglass between me and where Nora would sit. She came in looking exhausted. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. She picked up the phone on her side and I picked up mine. She kept saying she checked every room before she lit anything. She pulled the fire alarm first. She made sure nobody was inside. She said she couldn't let more people die. She said Brenda was going to cave and go to that event. She said that new kid with 30 days would have gone too. And that mom who was trying to get her kids back from foster care. She kept saying she had to do something. On my way home, I took the long way that went past the bar. There were news vans parked outside. Robert was standing in front of the burned building talking to a reporter. I slowed down enough to hear him through my open window. He was calling it domestic terrorism. He was saying Nora was a dangerous radical who couldn't handle seeing normal people have fun. I pulled into a strip mall parking lot and threw up again behind a dumpster. When I got home, my phone was ringing nonstop. Unknown numbers, mostly. Some were reporters asking for comments. One reporter left a message saying she wanted to tell Nora's side of the story. Most of the calls were different, though. People calling me terrible names. Saying Nora should burn in hell for destroying a man's business. One man left a message saying we were both trash and deserved whatever happened to us. I turned off my phone and sat in my dark living room. I couldn't stop thinking about that list in Nora's notebook. 23 names. 23 people that bar went after. And Garrett with that black X next to his name. The next morning, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The woman on the other end said her name was Rhiannon Kerr, and she was a journalist looking into predatory marketing to vulnerable populations. She spoke quietly and didn't push when I said I couldn't talk right then. She just left her number and said she'd be available if I wanted to share Nora's side of things. I wrote her number on a napkin and stuffed it in my purse. After hanging up, I pulled out all my financial papers and spread them across the kitchen table. Bank statements, retirement accounts, savings bonds my mom left me, everything. I did the math 3 times with the calculator. Even if I emptied my savings and cashed out some retirement early, I had maybe $15,000 total. The bail bondsman needed $5,000 just to get Nora out. A real lawyer would want at least $20,000 to start. My hands shook as I stared at the numbers. I couldn't afford both. I had to pick one or the other. I spent the rest of that day calling criminal defense attorneys from the phone book and online searches. Most wouldn't even quote a price until I came in for a consultation that cost $200. The ones who did give prices over the phone wanted $20,000 minimum as a retainer. One guy wanted $50,000 and laughed when I asked about payment plans. By late afternoon, I'd called 14 lawyers. Number 15 was named Alessandra Pierce. She listened to me explain the situation without interrupting. When I finished, she said she understood the moral complexity of what Nora did. She offered a payment plan starting with $5,000 down. Her total fee would be $30,000, but I could pay it over 2 years. I drove to her office that evening and signed the contract with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking. I wrote her a check for $5,000 from my retirement account, knowing the early withdrawal penalty would cost me another $1,500. Alessandra got to work immediately. She filed motions for discovery and scheduled a meeting with the prosecutor for next week. She told me we needed to build a mitigation case, not try to deny what happened. Our goal was reducing the sentence, not proving innocence. That night, I went to the AA meeting Nora usually attended. The moment I walked in, the room exploded into arguments. Half the people were saying Nora saved lives and did what nobody else had the courage to do. The other half said she made everything worse for recovering alcoholics everywhere. One man stood up and called her a terrorist who gave Robert ammunition against all of them. A woman screamed back that Nora was a hero. People were yelling over each other. The meeting leader tried to restore order, but nobody listened. I left when someone pointed at me and said I raised a criminal. Back home, I went through Nora's computer looking for anything that might help her case. Her browser history showed she'd been researching the bar for weeks. I found cached versions of their website with old promotions they'd taken down. Blackout Wednesday special, with shots for $1. Rock bottom prices during recovery week. Last call for last chances, advertised specifically during September, which is National Recovery Month. I took screenshots of everything and emailed them to Alessandra. She replied within minutes saying this was exactly what she needed. The next day, Les Warren from the city licensing department agreed to meet with me at a coffee shop downtown. He looked uncomfortable before I even started talking. He explained that unless Robert explicitly served intoxicated people or minors, his marketing fell under free speech protection. The First Amendment covered advertising even if it was morally wrong. He kept shifting in his seat and wouldn't make eye contact. His hands were tied, he said 3 times. There was nothing the city could do about targeted marketing. I asked if he'd want his kid targeted if they were trying to get sober. He just stared at his coffee and repeated that his hands were tied. 4 days later, I went for my next jail visit with Nora. She looked thinner already and had dark circles under her eyes. When she sat down across from me, I could see she hadn't been sleeping. She started talking immediately about how she'd checked every room twice before lighting anything. I cut her off and asked if she understood she might go to prison for 20 years. She said the law failed everyone and she had no choice. I told her there's always another choice. She said that was easy for me to say when I wasn't watching friends die. I said burning down buildings wasn't the answer. She said doing nothing wasn't the answer either. We went back and forth getting louder until we were both crying. The guard gave us a warning about keeping our voices down. We spent the last 5 minutes of the visit just looking at each other through the scratched glass, tears running down both our faces. 2 days later, I had to liquidate another chunk of my 401k to cover Alessandra's ongoing fees and put money in Nora's commissary account. The early withdrawal penalty made me sick, but I signed the papers anyway. The financial advisor at the bank tried to talk me out of it, showing me charts about compound interest and retirement planning. I just kept signing where he pointed. At this rate, I'd be working until I was 70, maybe 75. That evening, I checked Facebook and saw Robert had launched a GoFundMe calling himself a victim of sobriety extremism. The description said a radical anti-alcohol terrorist had destroyed his life's work because she couldn't handle seeing normal people have fun. Within 2 days, he'd raised $30,000. The comments section was full of people saying alcoholics needed to take personal responsibility for their own problems. Someone wrote that if you can't handle seeing a bar, you shouldn't leave the house. Another person said addicts always blame everyone else for their weakness. I read comment after comment until my stomach hurt so bad I had to run to the bathroom. I closed my laptop and left it closed. 3 days later, I ran into Robert at the hardware store while I was buying a new deadbolt for my front door. He stood near the paint section talking to a contractor about rebuilding plans, and I ducked behind an aisle to avoid him, but could hear everything. He was laughing about his drunk hunting system, telling the guy it was like fishing where you just had to know what bait to use. He said the weak ones at meetings always gave themselves away by how they held their coffee cups or checked their phones too much. The contractor asked if that was legal, and Robert said everything was legal if you knew how to frame it right. I pulled out my phone and started recording as he explained how he paid his bartenders $50 for each person they got drinking again, with bonuses for anyone over 5 years sober. He joked that some alcoholics were so easy you could get them with just a friendly smile and a free beer. The contractor laughed uncomfortably while Robert kept going, saying the best targets were the ones going through divorces or job losses because they were already looking for excuses. I recorded 4 minutes of him bragging before the contractor said he had to go. When I sent the recording to Alessandra, she called back within 10 minutes saying it wasn't admissible since I'd recorded without consent in a 2-party state. The next morning, I woke up to 37 pizza deliveries I hadn't ordered, all demanding payment at my door. My address had been posted on some website calling me a terrorist sympathizer, and the comments underneath included threats to burn my house down like my daughter burned the bar. I spent the morning installing new locks and a security camera system I couldn't really afford, then started taking different routes to work and parking in different spots. Every car that followed me for more than 2 turns made my hands shake on the steering wheel. A week later, Alessandra forwarded me the prosecutor's initial plea offer, and I had to sit down when I read it. Quentin Graham wanted 15 years with possibility of parole in 7 for first-degree arson. Alessandra said this was just their opening position for negotiation, but 15 years kept repeating in my head. Nora would be 37 when she got out if she took that deal. Her whole life would be gone. Alessandra shifted our strategy that afternoon, explaining we needed to build a mitigation case showing why Nora did what she did. We started gathering her treatment records from the past 5 years, collecting character letters from people in her recovery group, and documenting every person Robert's bar had hurt. She needed the prosecutor to see Nora as someone trying to save lives, not just an arsonist. I spent days calling people for letters and tracking down documentation. When I visited Nora and told her about the strategy, she immediately wanted to go public with her full story to explain everything. Alessandra had already warned her that anything she said publicly could be used against her in court, so we worked out a compromise where Nora would write a statement that Alessandra would review before any release. Nora spent the next 3 visits showing me draft after draft of her explanation, crossing out words and rewriting sentences over and over. 2 weeks later, Rhiannon's article about predatory bar marketing came out in the local paper, mentioning our case without using names. The online comments turned into a war between people horrified by the targeting of vulnerable people and others saying alcoholics deserved whatever happened to them for being weak. One commenter wrote that if you can't handle seeing alcohol, you shouldn't leave your house. Another said addiction was just an excuse for bad behavior. The article got shared thousands of times locally, and even got picked up by some recovery advocacy sites. The day after the article, Alessandra called to say Quentin had added a charge of reckless endangerment to the case. He claimed Nora couldn't have known for certain the building was empty when she set the fire, even though she'd checked every room and pulled the alarm. Alessandra explained this was just pressure tactics to force us into accepting a plea deal. I doubled my anxiety medication that week, but it still wasn't enough to stop the panic attacks. I decided to track down Brenda, Nora's sponsor, who hadn't been to meetings since her husband filed for divorce. I found her at her sister's apartment, 20 pounds lighter and holding herself like she might break. She showed me the text she'd almost sent to Robert's bar that night, asking about their specials. We sat on her couch while she deleted the bar's number from her phone, her hands shaking the whole time. She said Nora probably saved her life by burning that place down. The next week, I saw an ad in the paper for a different bar across town, advertising second chance shots with a picture of broken sobriety coins in a shot glass. I took photos and sent them to both Rhiannon and Les, asking if this was the new trend now that Robert had shown it worked. Les wrote back saying they were reviewing policy options, but any changes would take months to implement through proper channels. Through a Freedom of Information request Alessandra filed, we finally got copies of all complaints filed against Robert's bar over the past 5 years. 12 different people had reported being specifically targeted while in recovery, describing bartenders who showed up at meetings and befriended them before trying to get them to drink. Every single case had been closed for insufficient evidence of illegal activity. The pattern was obvious but legally meaningless since targeting vulnerable people for profit wasn't technically against any law. 3 days later, I stood at the podium in the city council chambers with my 2 minutes ticking down on the timer. The room was packed with people on both sides of this mess, some holding signs supporting Nora, others calling her a terrorist. I talked fast about how bars were hunting people in recovery, how they sent fake alcoholics into meetings to drag real ones back to drinking, how Garrett was dead at 23 because of it. Half the room started clapping when I mentioned the Chips for Shots promotion, but the other half started yelling about personal choice and free markets, and how nobody forced anyone to drink. One councilwoman kept nodding and writing notes while another rolled his eyes every time I mentioned predatory marketing. My time ran out mid-sentence and security motioned me back to my seat while people shouted over each other. That night my phone rang at 11 with a collect call from the jail. Nora was sobbing so hard I could barely understand her at first. Her cellmate had gotten drugs smuggled in somehow and started overdosing right there in their tiny cell. Nora held her head while she seized and screamed for the guards who took forever to get there with Narcan. The woman survived, but Nora kept saying over and over through the static that this was what Robert caused. This was what happened when you pushed people back into addiction. This was why she had to burn it down. The call cut off after 15 minutes, and I sat there holding the dead phone. 2 days later, Alessandra called to say she'd had an interesting meeting with Quentin. He'd asked to speak with her privately and admitted his uncle had been in recovery for 10 years before a bar started targeting him with special promotions. The uncle relapsed and lost his job and family within 6 months. Quentin said he still had to follow the law, but he understood the moral complexity better now. He hinted that he might be flexible on plea negotiations if we could show strong mitigation evidence. The next week, the psychiatric evaluation finally came back. The psychiatrist wrote that Nora showed clear signs of moral injury from watching multiple friends relapse and die after being targeted. She had trauma symptoms from feeling helpless to stop preventable deaths. Most importantly, the report said Nora's actions came from a genuine belief that she was saving lives in the absence of legal remedies. Alessandra said this was exactly what we needed for our mitigation argument. Then the other shoe dropped. A process server showed up at my door with papers from Robert's lawyer. He was suing both Nora and me personally for $2 million in damages, lost revenue, and emotional distress. My hands shook as I read through the pages of claims about how we'd destroyed his livelihood and reputation. I called my insurance company, but they said they wouldn't cover intentional criminal acts. The agent actually laughed when I explained the situation. I was looking at total bankruptcy on top of my daughter facing prison. I saw on the news that the insurance adjuster had finished examining the bar. Robert stood in front of the burned building telling reporters about his plans to rebuild bigger and better than before. He talked about a grand reopening with special promotions for everyone who'd supported him through this difficult time. The camera zoomed in on his face as he smirked and said something about rising from the ashes stronger than ever. I wanted to throw my remote through the TV. Les Warren called me that afternoon with something interesting. He'd been quietly working on draft language for a city ordinance that would restrict marketing specifically targeting people in recovery programs. Bars couldn't advertise at treatment centers or use recovery language in promotions. He said getting it passed would be tough with the current council, but some members were listening. It was the first real hint that something might change systemically. During my next jail visit, Nora and I sat with a yellow legal pad between us making lists. On one side, we wrote the pros of taking a plea deal. On the other, the pros of going to trial. 6 months versus maybe 20 years. Certainty versus the chance to tell the whole story publicly. We went back and forth for the entire visit, crossing things out and adding new points. Trial would mean putting recovering alcoholics on the stand to testify about being hunted. It would mean making them relive their relapses. But it would also expose what Robert did to a jury. We couldn't decide, and our time ran out with the list unfinished. Rhiannon called the next morning sounding defeated. Robert's lawyer had sent her paper a cease and desist letter threatening to sue for defamation if she wrote another word about the case. Her editor had immediately pulled her off the story, saying the paper couldn't afford a legal fight with a business owner who had insurance money coming. She'd already emailed me all her research files before they made her delete everything from her work computer. She apologized for abandoning us but said she had a mortgage and couldn't lose her job. That weekend, the recovery community organized a vigil in the park for Garrett and everyone else who died after being targeted by predatory bars. I watched from across the street as 200 people showed up with candles and photos. Someone had made a poster with Garrett's face and his sobriety date. People took turns at the microphone sharing stories about friends they'd lost. Then Robert's car drove by, slowing down as he held his phone out the window, taking pictures of everyone there. Several people started yelling at him, but he just smiled and kept filming before driving away. I walked back to my car feeling sick about Robert taking photos of grieving people. Tuesday night, I went to my regular AA meeting expecting support, but the group secretary stood up and said we needed to vote on something important. She explained that some members felt uncomfortable with all the talk about Nora's case and wanted to keep outside issues out of our discussions. The vote happened by show of hands, and 23 people voted yes while only 4 voted no. I grabbed my purse and left without saying goodbye to anyone. That support system I'd counted on for 3 years just disappeared. The next morning, Brenda called asking if I'd come back to the vigil because she wanted to speak. I found her standing at the microphone with 60 days on her new sobriety chip. She told everyone about the 5 different times bars had sent people after her over the years. Once at her daughter's wedding reception, once at her mother's funeral, 3 times just walking past bars on her way to work. She said Nora burning that place down might have saved her life because she'd been ready to give up that night. Her voice broke when she said she thinks about Nora's sacrifice every day. I recorded it on my phone for Nora to hear later. That afternoon, I sat in Alessandra's office looking at all our files and evidence spread across her conference table. She put her hand on my shoulder and said we needed to be realistic about our chances. The prosecutor had all the evidence they needed for conviction. Our best hope was keeping Nora out of prison for decades, and maybe the city would pass that ordinance Les had been working on. I stopped hoping for real justice that day and started focusing on damage control. 3 days later, we all sat in a small conference room at the courthouse for the plea conference. Quentin laid out their new offer on a single sheet of paper. 2nd-degree arson, 9 months in county jail, 5 years probation, $40,000 in restitution. With time served and good behavior, Nora would do 6 months. Alessandra leaned over and whispered, "This was as good as we'd get." The alternative was trial and risking 20 years. Nora sat there reading the paper over and over while I watched her hands shake. She asked Quentin if the ordinance Les proposed had any chance of passing. He said maybe, but he couldn't promise anything. Nora looked at me and said, 6 months was worth it if even one person stayed sober because of what she did. She didn't want to put other recovering alcoholics through testifying about their relapses at trial. I held her hand while she signed the plea agreement. 2 weeks passed before the sentencing hearing. The courtroom was packed with people from both sides. Robert went first with his victim impact statement, standing at the podium in an expensive suit. He talked about losing 30 years of hard work to a criminal who couldn't control herself. He said his employees lost their jobs because of one person's mental instability. He never mentioned the people he'd hunted. When my turn came, I brought Nora's notebook with the list of names. I read each name out loud and said how long they'd been sober before Robert's people got to them. The judge sat there taking notes without any expression on her face. She thanked us both for our statements and said she'd made her decision. The judge accepted the plea exactly as written. 9 months with credit for time served, 5 years probation, mandatory therapy twice a week, $40,000 in restitution to be paid over 10 years. She said vigilante justice could never be condoned regardless of motivation, but she recognized the defendant's genuine belief she was saving lives. She said the case raised important questions about predatory business practices that the legislature should address. Then she banged her gavel and it was over. But not really over because Robert was already on his phone with contractors. 4 months went by while Nora served her time. I visited every week and watched her lose weight and get these dark circles under her eyes. Then one morning, Rhiannon called to say her book was coming out. She'd quit the newspaper and spent months investigating predatory marketing in the recovery industry. Our case got its own chapter with all the evidence she'd gathered before her editor shut her down. The book sold 12,000 copies the first week, and started conversations on social media. But Robert had already rebuilt his bar with the insurance money. Some things don't change no matter how many people know the truth. Brenda started texting me updates about her recovery. She'd made it to 90 days, then 6 months, and started sponsoring 3 women who'd been targeted by bars. She taught them how to recognize the hunters and protect themselves. She said small victories matter even when the war keeps going. Every text reminded me that Nora's sacrifice meant something to someone. Then I saw the announcement on Facebook. Robert's grand reopening with what he called refined marketing that followed all regulations. The ads didn't specifically mention recovery programs, but everyone knew what starting over specials and second chance happy hour really meant. The law still couldn't touch him, but at least people were watching now. Some customers stayed away, and a few bartenders quit. Progress comes in tiny steps sometimes. 2 weeks later, I got a call from Les Warren saying the city council was voting on his ordinance that night. I drove downtown and found the meeting room packed with people from both sides arguing loudly before anything even started. The council members looked tired as they called for order and started working through the agenda. When they got to the ordinance, Les explained it would create a 500-foot buffer zone between any recovery-related marketing and treatment facilities or meeting locations. Robert stood up immediately, claiming this violated his First Amendment rights to advertise his business however he wanted. The council debated for 2 hours with people shouting from the audience every few minutes. Finally, they voted 4-3 to pass the ordinance, but everyone knew Robert would sue before the ink dried. Sure enough, the next morning news reports said Robert had already filed a federal lawsuit claiming the city was discriminating against legal businesses and violating free speech protections. My phone rang that afternoon and I was surprised to hear Quentin Graham on the other end. He told me he'd been working with state legislators after seeing what happened with Nora's case and realizing how many people get targeted this way. He said change happens slowly through the system, but at least people were starting to pay attention now. He mentioned 3 different bills being drafted to protect people in recovery from predatory marketing, but warned they'd face heavy opposition from business groups. I started going to Al-Anon meetings to learn how to support Nora when she got out without making things worse. The first meeting felt strange, sitting in a circle with other parents and spouses talking about their loved ones' addictions. They taught me about boundaries and not trying to control things I couldn't change, which was harder than I expected. One woman talked about visiting her son in prison for 5 years and how she had to learn to live her own life while still loving him. Another man described letting his wife face consequences without rescuing her every time she messed up. I took notes and tried to understand how to help Nora without enabling her or taking over her recovery. Meanwhile, Nora spent her days in county jail writing letters, and one morning she asked me to mail one to Garrett's family. She'd written 4 pages taking responsibility for the fire, but explaining why she felt she had no choice after watching him die. She told them about his sobriety date tattoo, and how the bartenders still went after him knowing he was trying to stay clean. She didn't ask for forgiveness, but wanted them to know his death mattered, and she tried to stop it from happening to others. I mailed it, but never heard back from them, which wasn't surprising given everything. The civil lawsuit from Robert dragged on for months with depositions and meetings, until finally my lawyer called saying we'd reached a settlement. $40,000 to be paid over 10 years, which meant $400 every month until I turned 68. My retirement savings were already gone from legal fees, so this meant working forever. But at least Nora would have a chance at life after prison. I signed the papers feeling sick, but knowing I had no better options. After 9 months, that felt like years. I got the call that Nora was released to a halfway house to finish her sentence. I drove to pick her up with a bag of her clothes and some personal items they'd allow at the facility. She looked thin and tired, walking out in the same clothes she'd worn to court months earlier. We didn't talk much during the drive to the halfway house, which sat in an old neighborhood near downtown. Her room was small with a single bed and dresser, but I helped her arrange her things to make it feel less institutional. She had to follow strict rules, including curfews and mandatory meetings and random drug tests, but at least she wasn't behind bars anymore. 2 days later, we drove together to the cemetery where someone had put up a small memorial for Garrett. Fresh flowers sat in a vase, and someone had left a sobriety coin on the stone marker. Nora knelt down and told him she was still sober after everything, and always would be no matter what. We stood there for a long time, not trying to make sense of it, or find meaning in what happened. Some things don't have neat endings or clear lessons, and you just have to accept them and keep going. Life became about managing each day as it came, with Nora's ongoing recovery and probation requirements and my monthly payments to Robert. The legal fights over predatory marketing continued in courts and legislatures, with small victories and big setbacks. Robert's bar stayed open with his careful new marketing that skirted the rules while still targeting vulnerable people. But we kept going because what else could we do except keep fighting in whatever small ways we could manage? Sometimes that's the only victory you get, when the system protects the predators and punishes the people trying to save lives. Thanks for letting me poke around these questions with you today. Really hope my little wonderings were worth your time. I'll catch you next time. Subscribe for more content like this.